I've been working hospice care for 12 years now, and let me tell you, you see things in this job that stay with you long after your shift ends. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepare me for what happened during those 3 weeks at Willowbrook Manor. My name's Cordelia Vance, and I work the night shift because, honestly, I prefer it. Less chaos, fewer families hovering around, and the patients who are still lucid tend to open up more in the quiet hours. There's something about darkness that makes people want to share their secrets, their fears, their unfinished business. It started with Mrs. Thessley in room 114. Sweet old lady, maybe 78, with lung cancer that had spread everywhere it shouldn't have. She'd been with us about a week when she grabbed my arm one morning as I was checking her vitals. She came again last night, Mrs. Thessley whispered, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Who came, honey? I asked, thinking maybe a family member had stopped by after visiting hours. The nurse in white. She stood right there by my window, just watching me, around 3 in the morning, maybe a bit after. I frowned. All our nursing staff wore scrubs, colorful ones, actually. Hospital policy was to avoid clinical white because it reminded patients too much of, well, hospitals. Are you sure it wasn't one of us? Maybe Janet from the evening shift running late? Mrs. Thessley shook her head firmly. No, dear. This woman wore one of those old-fashioned white dresses, like nurses used to wear, with a little cap and everything. She didn't say anything, just stood there looking at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. I chalked it up to morphine. Pain medication can cause vivid hallucinations, especially in elderly patients. I made a note in her chart and thought nothing more of it, until Mr. Garrett in 118 mentioned her too. There's a woman who comes into my room at night, he told me a few days later. Wears all white like an old-time nurse. Just stand there staring. Gives me the creeps. Then Mrs. Chan in 121 said the same thing, and Mr. Polk in 115. Always the same description. A woman in white. Vintage nurse's uniform, appearing around 3 in the morning, never speaking, just watching. By the end of the second week, 6 different patients had reported seeing her. All of them lucid, all of them describing identical details down to the small white cap and the sad expression. I started wondering if we had a problem with someone getting into the facility, maybe a mentally ill person who thought she worked here. I talked to Dr. Martinez about it during morning rounds. Could be mass hallucination, he said, not looking up from his clipboard. Sometimes patients feed off each other's stories. Or maybe it's the new batch of morphine. I'll have pharmacy check it. But I wasn't convinced. These weren't confused, end-stage patients rambling about pink elephants. These were people who could tell you what they had for breakfast and remember their grandchildren's names. So I decided to stay alert during my rounds. Started carrying a small flashlight and checking every corner, every shadow. Made extra trips down the hall around 3 a.m., listening for footsteps that weren't mine. It was on a Tuesday night. I remember because Tuesday was when we got fresh flowers with common area that I finally saw her. I was coming out of Mr. Garrett's room after adjusting his floor when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure in white walking slowly from room to room. Not rushing, not sneaking, just moving with purpose, like she belonged there. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to walk toward her. "Excuse me," I called out softly, not wanting to wake the patients. "Excuse me, miss." The figure paused outside room 114, Mrs. Thessley's room, and turned toward me. Even in the dim hallway lighting, I could see her clearly now. She wore a pristine white dress that fell to mid-calf, with a small white cap pinned to dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was young, maybe mid-30s, but her eyes held a weariness that seemed ancient. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. She looked at me with those sad, knowing eyes, and I felt something pass between us. Not fear exactly, but recognition, like she was acknowledging that I could see her, that I was finally paying attention. Then she simply faded away. Not dramatically, not with any special effects you'd see in movies. She just became less solid, less there, until she was gone entirely. I stood in that hallway for 10 minutes, shaking and questioning my sanity. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew the patients weren't hallucinating. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the facility's archives. Willowbrook Manor had been operating since 1952, and they kept records of everything. Staff photos, incident reports, even old newsletters. I found her in a staff photo from 1967. Her name was Margaret Hollis, and according to her personnel file, she'd worked the night shift for 15 years before dying in a car accident on her way home from work. The accident happened at 3:17 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning in March. Margaret had been 29 years old and, according to her supervisor's notes, completely dedicated to her patients, often staying late to ensure their comfort. That night, I waited for her, positioned myself at the nurse's station with a clear view of the entire hallway. Sure enough, at exactly 3:17 a.m., she appeared at the far end of the corridor. This time, I didn't call out or try to approach her. I just watched as she made her rounds, stopping briefly outside each room, standing silently for a moment before moving on. There was something peaceful about it, something comforting rather than frightening. She was still making her rounds, I realized, still checking on her patients. 40-plus years after her death, when she reached the end of the hallway, she looked directly at me and nodded once, a simple acknowledgement between one night nurse and another. Then she was gone. Mrs. Thessaly passed away peacefully 2 days later, and I never saw Margaret again. But sometimes when I'm walking these halls in quiet hours before dawn, I swear I can feel someone else making rounds alongside me. And you know what? It doesn't scare me anymore. Some people are just born to be caregivers, and I guess not even death can change that. Story 2. Working the graveyard shift in hospice care, you hear a lot of dying wishes. Some want to see estranged family members one last time. Others ask you to make sure their pets are taken care of. I've had patients beg me to deliver love letters, return borrowed books, even water their garden plants. After 8 years doing this job, I thought I'd heard everything. Then I met Mr. Caspian Aldridge. He was admitted on a Thursday evening. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 2 weeks left if he was lucky. 83 years old, no family listed on his intake forms, which always breaks my heart a little. The man had lived through 8 decades of life and was going to die alone in a sterile room that smelled like disinfectant and artificial air freshener. Mr. Caspian was different from most of my patients, though sharp as a tack, for one thing. Most folks his age with a condition are pretty heavily medicated by the time they reach us, but he refused most of the pain management options, said he needed to keep his head clear for something important. It was during my second night with him that he made his request. Bastian, he said, that's my name, Bastian Torres. I need you to do something for me, something that can't wait. I pulled up a chair next to his bed. What do you need, Mr. Caspian? His hands were shaking as he reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a set of old keys. I need you to go to my house. 1247 Elm Street, the blue one with the broken mailbox. In the backyard, there's an old oak tree. Count 15 paces north from the trunk, then dig down about 2 feet. You'll find a metal box. I stare at the keys in his outstretched hand. Mr. Caspian, I can't just leave my shift to go digging in your yard. Please. His voice cracked, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. I buried something there 40 years ago, and I can't die knowing it's still in the ground. It's eating me alive, son, has been for decades. There was something in his voice, a desperation that went beyond physical pain. I've learned to recognize that particular kind of anguish. It's the sound of someone carrying a secret so heavy it's crushing them from the inside. What did you bury, Mr. Caspian? He closed his eyes. The truth. I should have said no. Should have told him I'd pass his request on to social services. Let them handle it. But there was something about the old man that got to me. Maybe it was the way he looked so small in that hospital bed. Or maybe it was because I kept thinking about how he had no one else to ask. My shift ends at 7. I heard myself saying, if you can hold on until then. The relief on his face was immediate. Thank you, son. Thank you. I spent the rest of my shift watching him like a hawk. terrified he'd die before I could fulfill his request. When 7 a.m. rolled around, I drove straight to Elm Street instead of going home to sleep. 1247 was easy to spot, a small blue house that had seen better days, with a mailbox hanging at an odd angle like a broken arm. The yard was overgrown, weeds pushing through cracks in the sidewalk. It looked like no one had lived there in years. The backyard was even worse, a jungle of tall grass and brambles. But the oak tree was there, ancient and gnarled, its trunk easily 4 feet across. I paced off 15 steps north, pulled a small shovel from my car, and started digging. 2 feet down, my shovel hit metal with a hollow clank. The box was smaller than I'd expected. Maybe the size of a shoebox, made of some kind of tin that had rusted around the edges, but was still intact. My hands were shaking as I pulled it from the ground. Inside were 3 things: a stack of old photographs, a yellowed newspaper clipping, and a letter written in careful handwriting. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair and a bright smile. The newspaper clipping was from October 15, 1984. Local woman missing, police seek information. The headline made my stomach drop, but it was a letter that made my blood run cold. It was addressed to whoever finds this, and dated just a few days after the newspaper article. In it, Mr. Caspian confessed to witnessing the murder of Sarah Beth Morrison, the woman in the photographs. He'd seen his neighbor, a man named Frank Delacroix, strangling her behind the old grain elevator on the outskirts of town. But he'd been too scared to come forward, too worried about what Frank might do to him if he talked. The letter went on to describe how Frank had buried Sarah's body somewhere near Miller's Creek, how he bragged about it when he was drunk, thinking Mr. Caspian was too far away to hear. It included details only someone who was there would know: what Sarah had been wearing, the time of night it happened, even the license plate number of Frank's truck. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. I drove back to the hospice in a daze, the box sitting on my passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode. Mr. Caspian was awake when I walked into his room, his eyes immediately going to the metal container in my hands. "You found it," he whispered. "Mr. Caspian, this is evidence of a murder." He nodded slowly. "I know. I've known for 40 years. Every single day, I've thought about that poor girl and her family, wondering if she ever got a proper burial, if they ever knew what happened to her. Why didn't you come forward back then? Frank Delacroix was a mean son of a bitch, had connections all over town. I was just a nobody working at the hardware store. I convinced myself no one would believe me, that I'd end up dead too." He looked down at his hands. "I was a coward, Bastian. I let fear keep me quiet, and that girl's family never got justice." I sat down heavily in the chair next to his bed. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Take it to the police. Tell them everything. Let Sarah Beth finally rest in peace." He paused, his breathing labored. "And let me die knowing I finally did the right thing." Mr. Caspian passed away 3 hours later, just before my shift ended. He went peacefully, the most relaxed I'd seen him since his arrival. I sat in my car in the hospice parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at that metal box and wrestling with what to do. Part of me wondered if I should just rebury it, let sleeping dogs lie. Frank Delacroix was probably dead by now anyway. The murder had happened 40 years ago. But then I thought about Sarah Beth Morrison and her family, about the questions they'd carried all these years, about the closure they'd never gotten. I drove to the police station and handed over everything. The detective I spoke with was skeptical at first, but when he ran the names through their system, his entire demeanor changed. Turns out Sarah Beth's case had never been closed, and Frank Delacroix had died in prison 5 years earlier, serving time for an unrelated assault charge. They found her remains exactly where Mr. Caspian's letter said they would be. The newspaper ran a story about it a few weeks later. 40-year-old cold case solved by deathbed confession. Sarah Beth's sister, now in her 60s, was quoted saying she could finally find peace knowing what had happened to her sister. I kept a copy of that article in my locker at work. Sometimes, when I'm having a particularly rough night, when I'm questioning whether any of this matters, I pull it out and remember Mr. Caspian. Some secrets are too heavy to carry to the grave. And sometimes, doing the right thing is the only way to die in peace. Story 3. In 15 years of hospice work, I've learned that some places hold on to memories like a sponge holds water. Most of the time, it's comforting. You can feel the love that families have shared a room, the peaceful passings, the gentle goodbyes. But sometimes, a place absorbs something darker, something that refuses to let go. My name is Imogen Blackwell, and I need to tell you about Room 237 at Serenity Gardens Hospice. Every facility has that one room. You know the one I'm talking about. The room that makes staff members find excuses not to go in alone. The room that somehow always feels cold in the rest of the building. The room where patients seem to decline faster than they should. For us, that room was 237. I first noticed a pattern about 6 months into working at Serenity Gardens. Room 237 had the highest mortality rate in the facility, which shouldn't have been unusual given our line of work. Except for one thing. Patients assigned to that room consistently last a half as long as our statistical averages suggested they should. Dr. Patterson, our medical director, had a dozen explanations. Maybe the room faced east and got too much morning sun. Maybe the ventilation wasn't quite right. Maybe it was just coincidence, a statistical anomaly that would level out over time. But the patients knew better. "There's no room in here," Mrs. Araminta whispered to me on her first night in 237. She was a tiny woman, maybe 90 pounds, soaking wet, with colon cancer that had metastasized everywhere. But her mind was sharp as ever. "What do you mean, Mrs. Araminta?" I asked, adjusting her blankets. "Too many people. They're all standing around my bed, just watching me. How am I supposed to sleep with all these strangers staring at me?" I looked around the room. It was just the two of us, same as always. "I don't see anyone else here, sweetheart." She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "The tall man by the window, he's been there all evening. And there's a woman in the corner who keeps crying. Oh, and there's a young boy sitting in the chair over there." She pointed to an empty recliner near the foot of her bed. "He can't be more than 16, poor thing. What's a child doing in a place like this?" The thing that unnerved me wasn't what she was saying. Hallucinations aren't uncommon in our patients, especially with the medications they're on. What bothered me was how specific she was, how clearly she could see these supposed visitors. Most hallucinations are vague, shadowy things. Mrs. Araminta was describing these people like she was looking at family photos. "They don't talk much," she continued, settling back into her pillows. "Just stand there looking sad. I think they're waiting for something." That night, I did something I'd never done before. I stayed after my shift and researched the history of Room 237. What I found made my stomach turn. In the past 5 years alone, we had 43 deaths in that room. The facility average was maybe 6 or 7 deaths per room in the same time period. But it wasn't just the numbers that caught my attention. It was the circumstances. Most of our patients passed peacefully, surrounded by family, with adequate pain management and emotional support. But the deaths in 237 were different. They were often sudden, unexpected, and almost always occurred when the patient was alone. Family members frequently reported that their loved ones seemed terrified in the hours before they died, speaking about seeing people who weren't there, begging to be moved to a different room. I dug deeper, going back through old incident reports and staff notes. The pattern held. For 15 years, Room 237 had been a place where people died badly. The next night, Mrs. Araminta looked exhausted. "They're getting closer," she told me during my rounds. "The tall man moved next to my bed, and the crying woman is standing right behind you." I turned around instinctively, even though I knew no one was there. "Mrs. Araminta, would you like me to see about moving you to a different room?" "Oh, no, dear. I don't think they'd like that. Besides, I'm starting to understand what they want." "What do they want?" She looked directly at me with eyes that seemed far too wise for someone in her condition. "They want to help. They're trying to show me the way." "What way?" "The way across. They've all made the journey, you see. They know how hard it can be to let go, especially when you're scared and alone. So they stay to help the next person and the next person after that." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. "How do you know that?" "The boy told me. Sweet child, his name was Marcus. He was only 17 when he died. Leukemia. He's been here the longest. Helps coordinate the others. He explained it all to me. That night, I couldn't shake what Mrs. Araminta had said. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I went back to our records and searched for any patient named Marcus who had died young. I found him. Marcus Chun, age 17, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. He died in room 237 8 years ago, alone because his family lived 3 states away and couldn't get there in time. According to the notes, he'd been terrified of dying, had begged the staff not to leave him alone. The next day, I started looking up the other patients Mrs. Araminta had described. The tall man by the window, that sounded like Robert Walsh, a 6'4" construction worker who had died of lung disease 3 years earlier. The crying woman could have been Dolores Vega, who had passed 2 years ago after a long battle with breast cancer, leaving behind 5 young children. All of them had died in room 237. All of them had died afraid and alone. Mrs. Araminta passed away on her 4th night in the room, but it wasn't like the other deaths I'd witnessed there. She went peacefully, with a small smile on her face. Her last words to me were, "Tell Marcus I said thank you." After her funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about room 237. I started volunteering for extra shifts, specifically requesting to work with patients assigned to that room. I began sitting with them, especially during those final hours when the visitors seemed most active. What I discovered changed everything. The patients who had someone with them, someone living to hold their hand and talk them through their fear, they passed peacefully. It was the ones who were alone, the ones who only had the spirits for company, who struggled. The dead weren't haunting room 237. They were trying to comfort the dying, to ease that terrible transition from life to whatever comes next. But without the warmth of the living, without someone to bridge that gap between worlds, their help could only go so far. I put in a request to have room 237 converted into a family suite, with extra space for relatives to stay overnight. I also made sure it was never assigned to patients who didn't have family or friends who could be with them during their final days. The room's mortality rate returned to normal within 6 months. I still work at Serenity Gardens, and I still pass by room 237 every shift. Sometimes, especially late at night, I swear I can feel them in there, Marcus and Robert and Dolores and all the others. But they're not sad anymore. They're not waiting. They're just watching over the families inside, making sure no one has to face death alone. And you know what? I think that's exactly what they were trying to do all along. Story 4. Sometimes patients bring possessions that carry more than sentimental value. I learned this the hard way when Mrs. Isadora Blackthorne arrived at Meadowview Hospice with nothing but a small leather suitcase and an ornate music box that should have stayed buried with its previous owner. My name is Dashiell Moreau, and I've been working hospice care for 9 years. In that time, I've seen families bring in photo albums, favorite blankets, even collections of ceramic cats, anything to make their loved ones' final days feel more like home. But I'd never seen anything quite like Mrs. Isadora's music box. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. Mahogany would polish to a mirror shine, with intricate brass inlays forming patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The lid was topped with a small brass key that you could wind to make it play. But it was a melody that got to you, a haunting, melancholy tune that seemed familiar, even though I was certain I'd never heard it before. Mrs. Isadora was 94, sharp as a tack despite the bone cancer that was eating her alive. She'd been a music teacher for 60 years before retiring, and when she placed that music box on her bedside table, she handled it like it was made of spun glass. "Been in my family for generations," she told me that first day, her fingers tracing the brass inlays. "My great-grandmother left it to me with very specific instructions." "What kind of instructions?" I asked, checking her for. She gave me a look that was equal parts sad and mysterious. That it needs to be passed on to someone who understands its purpose when my time comes. I figured she was talking about the sentimental value. Maybe want to make sure it went to someone who would appreciate its craftsmanship. Boy, was I wrong. The music box started opening on its own the second night she was with us. I was doing my midnight rounds when I heard that haunting melody drifting from her room. found her sitting up in bed, staring at the box with tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Isadora, are you all right?" She wiped her eyes and nodded toward the music box, which was playing even though no one had wound it. "She's calling to them." "Who's calling to who?" "My great-grandmother. She was what people used to call a medium, back when such things were more openly discussed. This box was her tool for helping spirits communicate with the living world." She reached over and gently closed the lid, stopping the music mid-note. "It's been in my family for over a century, passed down to whoever has a gift." I'll admit, I was skeptical. You hear a lot of strange stories in this job, especially from patients on heavy pain medication. But over the next few days, I started noticing things that made me reconsider. The music would start playing at random times, always that same melancholy tune, and whenever it did, other patients in nearby rooms would become agitated. Not scared exactly, but expectant, like they were waiting for something. Mr. Chun in the next room started talking about his deceased wife visiting him. Mrs. Patterson down the hall began having detailed conversations with her dead brother. Even Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been mostly unresponsive since his stroke, started mumbling about seeing his parents. The thing is, these weren't the usual confused ramblings you expect from medicated patients. These conversations were specific, personal, filled with details about shared memories and inside jokes. Family members who came to visit were astonished by how accurately their loved ones were describing deceased relatives, including details they shouldn't have known. "The music opens a door," Mrs. Isadora explained to me one evening after the box had been particularly active. "It creates a bridge between this world and the next, makes it easier for those who pass to reach through, and comfort those who are preparing to join them." "That's impossible," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. She smiled sadly. "Is it? You work with dying people every day, Dashiell. Haven't you ever noticed how many of them speak about seeing deceased loved ones in their final hours? Haven't you wondered if maybe, just maybe, they're actually seeing something real?" I had wondered about that, actually. In 9 years of hospice work, I'd lost count of how many patients had described visits from dead spouses, parents, children. Medical professionals always explain it away as oxygen deprivation or medication side effects, but the patients always seemed so certain, so comforted by these experiences. The music box's influence seemed to be growing stronger. Patients throughout the wing were reporting visits from deceased family members, and the conversations were becoming more frequent and more detailed. But here's the strange part. Instead of being frightened or confused, the patients seemed more peaceful, more ready to let go. Mrs. Patterson, who had been fighting her cancer diagnosis with bitter determination, suddenly began talking about how her brother had told her it was okay to stop fighting, that he'd be waiting for her on the other side. She passed away 2 days later with a serene smile on her face. Mr. Chun, who had been anxious and restless since his arrival, calmed down completely after his wife's visits began. He told me she was helping him understand that death wasn't an ending but a reunion, and he seemed genuinely excited about joining her. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. One night, the music box opened while I was in Mrs. Isadora's room adjusting her morphine drip. The melody filled the air, and suddenly I felt something, a presence, warm and familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Do you feel her?" Mrs. Isadora whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The presence felt female, elderly, and incredibly kind, like being wrapped in a grandmother's hug. "That's my great-grandmother, Viviana. She's been with this box for 80 years, helping ease the transition for those who are ready to cross over. But she needs someone to take over the responsibility." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Isadora's eyes met mine, and I saw a lifetime of carrying this burden reflected there. "The box needs a keeper, someone who can help guide it to where it's needed most. Someone who works with the dying and understands the importance of what it does." I stared at the music box, still playing its haunting melody. "You want me to take it? Only if you're willing. It's not a burden I'd wish on someone who isn't ready for it. But I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you care for your patients, how you ease their fears. You have the right spirit for this work." Mrs. Isadora passed away peacefully 3 nights later, surrounded by what the medical staff couldn't see, but I now knew were there, Generations of her family come to welcome her home. I kept the music box. That was 6 months ago, and I've learned to work with its unique properties. When I sense that a patient is struggling with their transition, when they're afraid or fighting against the inevitable, I bring the box to their room. The music opens that door between worlds, allows their loved ones to reach through and offer comfort. I've seen husbands reunited with wives, children comforted by parents, friends offering final goodbyes. The box doesn't force anything. It simply makes possible what was always meant to be. Some people are meant to die alone, and that's okay too. But for those who need that final connection, that last conversation with someone they've lost, the music box is there. Mrs. Adore was right about one thing. It's not a burden. It's a privilege. And someday when my time comes, I'll need to find someone else who understands that helping people die well is just as important as helping them live well. Until then, the music plays on. Story 5. After 20 years in hospice care, I thought I'd seen everything. Until the phone calls started. My name is Serafina Kane, and I've been working the night shift at Restful Meadows Hospice since I was 23 years old. In 2 decades, I've held more hands during final moments than I care to count, listened to more deathbed confessions than a priest, and learned that dying is rarely as peaceful as the movies make it seem. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what began happening 3 months ago. It started with Mrs. Evangeline, a sweet old lady with emphysema who'd been with us for about a week. She was one of those patients who apologized for everything, for needing help to bathroom, for asking for extra blankets, for existing at all. Really? So when her bedside phone rang at exactly midnight on a Tuesday, I didn't think much of it. "Oh my," she said after hanging up. "That was my Harold." I was checking her oxygen levels and looked up. "Your Harold?" "My husband. He called to tell me he's waiting for me, that it's beautiful where he is." She had the most peaceful expression I'd ever seen on her face. "He's been gone for 8 years, you know. I've missed him so much." I figured it was a wrong number, maybe someone playing a cruel prank, or possibly one of her medications causing confusion. Harold was listed as deceased on her intake forms. But Mrs. Evangeline seemed so calm, so genuinely happy, that I didn't have a heart to question it. She passed away the next evening, quiet and content, whispering Harold's name. A week later, it happened again. Mr. Benedict, 91 years old, liver failure. His phone rang at midnight on the dot. I was in the hallway and heard him talking animatedly to whoever was on the other end, laughing for the first time since he'd been admitted. "Who was that, Mr. Benedict?" I asked when I went to check on him. "My little brother Tommy," he said, eyes bright with tears. Can you believe it? After all these years, he called to tell me he forgives me. We had a falling out back in '73, never spoke again. I've carried that guilt for 50 years, and tonight he told me it's okay, that he understands why I did what I did. I checked his chart. Thomas Benedict, listed as deceased 1998. Mr. Benedict died peacefully 2 days later. By the time the third midnight call happened, I was paying attention. Mrs. Cordelia, a former school teacher dying of bone cancer, received a call from her daughter, a daughter who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. "She told me she's proud of me," Mrs. Cordelia whispered after hanging up. "Said I was a good mother, that she never blamed me for the fight we had before she died." Oh! Serafina, I've been carrying that guilt for so long. I started keeping notes. Every midnight call was from a deceased family member. Every conversation involved forgiveness, love, or reassurance. And every patient who received a call died within 24 to 48 hours afterward. The phone company insisted there was no record of incoming calls to those numbers. I checked the phone logs myself. Nothing. But I could hear the conversations happening, could see the profound effect they had on the patients. I brought my concerns to Dr. Morrison, our facility director, but he brushed off my worries. End-stage patients often experience hallucinations, Serafina. It's actually quite common for them to have conversations with deceased loved ones. It's a natural part of the dying process. But I knew what I was seeing. These weren't hallucinations. The phones were actually ringing. The patients were actually talking to someone. And whoever was on the other end knew things. Personal details. family secrets, shared memories that brought comfort and closure. 2 months in, I decided to investigate further. When Mrs. Prudence's phone rang at midnight, I quietly picked up the extension at the nurse's station. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voice on the other end was familiar. It belonged to Mr. Fitzpatrick, a patient who had died in our facility 6 months earlier. I remembered him well, a kind old man who'd been worried about his wife being left alone. "Prudence, dear," his voice came through clear as day. "I know you're scared, but I'm here to tell you it's not frightening at all. It's like coming home after a very long journey." I hung up and ran to Mrs. Prudence's room. She was glowing with happiness, tears streaming down her face. "That was my William," she said. "He's been gone 3 years, but he called to tell me he'll be waiting for me. He described the most beautiful garden, said we'll tend it together like we always dreamed." William Fitzpatrick, Mr. Fitzpatrick's first name. I checked our old records. They'd never been patients at the same time, never could have met each other. Yet somehow, he was calling to comfort her. The calls became more frequent. Sometimes 2 or 3 in one night, always at midnight, always from deceased family members of patients who were close to passing. I started recognizing the voices, former patients of ours, reaching back to help guide others across. Then, on a foggy Thursday night in late October, my own bedside phone rang. I was doing paperwork at the nurse's station when I heard it. The familiar ring coming from the small phone we kept there for emergencies. I looked at the clock. 12 a.m. exactly. My hands were shaking as I answered. "Serafina." The voice was warm, familiar, and impossible. "It's Margaret. Margaret Thornfield. My mentor, the nurse who had trained me when I first started working hospice care 20 years ago. She died of a heart attack 5 years earlier, right here in facility during her night shift. Margaret." I whispered, "I know this is confusing, dear, but I need to warn you about something. The calls aren't random. There's a pattern you need to understand." My throat felt tight. "What pattern?" "The calls come to those who are ready to cross over, yes, but they also come to those who have unfinished business. The spirits of former patients reach out to help guide new ones, but there's a darker side to it." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes the calls aren't from loved ones. Sometimes they're from others, spirits who died badly, who are angry or lost. They try to trick the dying into crossing over before their time, before they're truly ready." I felt ice forming in my stomach. How do I tell the difference? Listen to what they say. True loved ones bring comfort, forgiveness, and peace. The others bring fear, guilt, and urgency. They tell people they need to come right now, or they'll be left behind. They prey on the patient's fears and regrets. Have any of our patients received those kinds of calls? There was a long pause. "Yes, and that's why I'm calling you. Mr. Aldrich in room 204 is going to receive a call tonight. Don't let him answer it alone." The line went dead. I ran to room 204. Mr. Aldrich was awake, staring at his bedside phone with a mixture of hope and terror. "It's been ringing for 10 minutes, he said, "but I'm afraid to answer it. Something doesn't feel right." I sat down next to his bed. "What doesn't feel right?" "The ring sounds wrong, angry. And I keep thinking about my brother Carl, how we fought before he died. What if he's calling to tell me he hates me? What if—" The phone rang again, and this time I answered it. The voice on the other end was cold, manipulative, nothing like the warm voices I'd heard in other calls. It claimed to be Carl, but spoke with venom, demanding that Mr. Aldrich come now or be left behind forever. I hung up and unplugged the phone. Mr. Aldrich lived for another 2 weeks, long enough for his real brother, still very much alive, to visit and reconcile with him. When he finally passed, it was with genuine peace, surrounded by family. Since then, I've learned to listen more carefully to the midnight calls. Most of them are genuine, former patients reaching back to help guide others home. But some are darker, and it's my job to protect the vulnerable from those voices that would pull them across before their time. Margaret was right about one thing. There's a pattern to everything. Life, death, and whatever comes after. It's all connected by invisible threads of love, loss, and unfinished business. And sometimes, Those threads manifest as midnight phone calls from the other side. Story 6. I've been working nights at Willowbrook Funeral Home for 15 years now, and let me tell you, you get used to the silence pretty quick. The hum of the refrigeration units, the occasional creak of old floorboards, maybe a car passing by on the street outside. That's about all the company you get when you're prepping bodies at 2 in the morning. But that Tuesday night in October, something was different. The body came in around 11 p.m. Euphemia Crowley, 83 years old, found dead in her kitchen by a neighbor who'd gotten worried when she didn't show up for their weekly bridge game. Natural causes, the paramedic said, though there was something about the whole situation that had the police asking questions. Nothing they could put their finger on, just odd circumstances. I'd handled plenty of elderly folks over the years, so this should have been routine. Euphemia was a small woman, probably had weighed more than 90 pounds, soaking wet. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a faded floral dress that smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't quite place. Something medicinal. I got her situated in drawer number 7, the one on the bottom row that always ran a bit colder than the others. Had to crouch down to slide her in, and I remember thinking how peaceful she looked. Too peaceful, maybe, for someone who'd supposedly had a heart attack. The viewing was scheduled for Thursday, so I had plenty of time to work on her. But first, I had 2 other bodies to finish up, a middle-aged man who died in a car accident and a young woman from a drug overdose. Sad cases, both of them, but at least straightforward. I was about halfway through embalming the accident victim when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a building settling. These old funeral homes make all kinds of noises, especially on cold nights like this one. But then I heard it again, a low, rhythmic sound that almost sounded like talking. I stopped what I was doing and listened. Nothing but the usual hums and creaks. Must be getting paranoid in my old age, I thought, and went back to work. 20 minutes later, there was again. This time I was sure of it. Someone was talking somewhere in the building. The problem was I was supposed to be alone. I set down my tools and walked out into the hallway, listening carefully. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the morgue, where we kept the refrigerated drawers. I grabbed a flashlight from my workstation, even though the hallway lights were on. Something about the darkness beyond the morgue doorway made me want the extra light. The morgue was cold and quiet when I stepped inside. 6 refrigerated units lined the wall, each with 3 drawers. Most were empty. We only had 4 bodies in the house that night. I stood there for a full minute, straining to hear anything unusual. Then it started again. It was definitely whispering, and it was coming from drawer number 7, Euphemia's drawer. Now, I've been in this business long enough to know that bodies can make sounds. Gases escaping, tissue settling, that sort of thing. It's not pleasant, but it's natural. This wasn't that, though. This was actual words, spoken so quietly I couldn't make them out. My hands were shaking a little as I reached for the drawer handle. The metal was ice cold against my palm, colder than it should have been even with the refrigeration running. I pulled the drawer open slowly, half expecting Euphemia to sit up and start talking to me. She didn't. She lay there just as peaceful as before, her hands folded neatly over her chest. But her lips, I swear her lips were moving. Just barely, like she was having a quiet conversation with someone only she could see. I leaned in closer, trying to catch what she was saying, and that's when I heard the first name clearly. Dorothy Henkins, she whispered. I knew that name. Dorothy had died about 3 years back, found dead in her garden with no clear cause. The doctor said it was probably a stroke, but her family had always insisted she was healthy as a horse. Marcus Pemberton, came the next whisper. Another name I recognized. Marcus had been the town librarian until he died suddenly in his sleep 2 years ago. Another case where the family suspected something but couldn't prove anything. The whispering continued, name after name, and I recognized every single one. They were all people who died in our little town over the past couple decades. All of them elderly, all of them alone, all of them under circumstances that seemed natural but left families with questions. I should have stepped back then. Should have closed that drawer and called the police or the coroner, or hell, maybe even a priest. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. That's when Euphemia's eyes snapped open. She looked right at me with eyes that were far too aware for someone who'd been dead for hours. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile, and in a voice as clear as day, she whispered my own name, Cornelius Blackthorne. I stumbled backward, slamming into the opposite wall hard enough to knock over a cart of instruments. The crash echoed to the morgue like thunder, but Euphemia never blinked, just kept staring at me with those knowing eyes. When the coroner arrived the next morning to investigate my frantic phone call, we found something interesting in Euphemia's house. A small notebook hidden in her bedroom, filled with names, addresses, and detailed notes about the daily routines of elderly residents around town. Next to each name was a date, and for 17 of them, that date matched exactly when those people had died. The last entry was her own name, dated the day she died. They never did figure out how she killed them all. The autopsies on the exhumed bodies showed traces of an exotic plant toxin, something that mimicked natural death and broke down quickly in the system. Euphemia had been a master gardener, apparently. I don't work nights anymore. Can't handle the quiet. Can't stand being alone with the bodies. But sometimes in my dreams, I still hear that whisper. My own name, spoken by lips that should never have moved again. Story 7. 8 years I've been working at Meadowbrook Funeral Home, and I thought I'd seen everything. Car accidents, suicides, natural deaths, you name it, I've handled it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during the blizzard of 2019. It started snowing around noon on a Wednesday, one of those storms that comes out of nowhere and dumps 3 feet in 6 hours. By evening, the roads were impassable, and I was stuck at the funeral home with 4 bodies that needed to be prepped for services later in the week. The power was flickering on and off, and the backup generator was making sounds that didn't fill me with confidence. Barnabas Wickham had come in that morning, before the storm hit. 62 years old, dropped dead of a massive heart attack while shoveling his driveway. His wife found him face down in the snow about an hour later. Sad story, but not uncommon. We get a lot of snow shoveling heart attacks up here in Minnesota. I decided to start with Barnabas, since his service was scheduled first. Got him on the table around 9 p.m. After the worst of the storm had settled into a steady, howling wind that rattled the old building's windows. The fluorescent lights kept flickering, casting weird shadows that made me jumpy, but I've always been able to work through distractions. The first thing I noticed was how warm he still felt. Bodies usually cool down pretty quick, especially in winter, and Barnabas had been dead for nearly 12 hours. But when I touched his arm and positioned him, his skin was almost not warm exactly, but not as cold as it should have been. I figured maybe it was just me. The heating system was working overtime against the storm, and I was probably running warmer than usual from the stress of being snowed in. So I got started with the arterial injection. Standard procedure. That's when things got weird. I was maybe 5 minutes into the embalming process when I felt resistance in the arterial tube. Not unusual. Sometimes there are clots or the positioning isn't right. But when I adjusted the pressure, I could swear I felt a pulse. A pulse. I stopped what I was doing and checked his wrist, his neck, anywhere I could find a major artery. Nothing. Dead as dead gets. But when I went back to the embalming, there was again a faint rhythmic resistance like his heart was still trying to beat. I was starting to think maybe I should call this off, wait until morning when I could get a second opinion, when Barnabas took a breath. Not a big, dramatic gasp like in the movies, just a quiet, natural breath like he was sleeping. His chest rose and fell once, then went still again. I nearly dropped the damn tube. My hands were shaking so bad I had to step back and take a minute to collect myself. Bodies don't breathe. They can't breathe. The lungs fill with embalming fluid. The heart stops pumping. The whole system shuts down. It's basic biology. But I'd seen what I'd seen. I was reaching for my phone to call. Hell, I don't know who I was going to call. The coroner? The police? The local priest? That's when Barnabas opened his eyes. Not the slow, groggy awakening of someone coming out of anesthesia. His eyes just snapped open, fully alert and locked onto mine. And the first thing he said, in a voice that was definitely not Barnabas Wickham's, was, "You're not Dr. Morrison." I stood there like an idiot, staring at a dead man who was talking to me. "Dr. Morrison?" I managed to croak out. "Where is he?" Barnabas sat up on the table, moving with an ease that shouldn't have been possible for someone who just had embalming fluid pumped into their arteries. "I need to see Dr. Morrison. He has to pay for what he did." "Sir, Dr. Morrison? There's no Dr. Morrison here. This is a funeral home, and you're—" I stopped. "What do you say? You're supposed to be dead?" Barnabas swung his legs over the side of the table and stood up. He was naked except for the sheet I draped over him, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "This building," he said, looking around with eyes that seemed to see things I couldn't. "This was his office. Right here, in this room." "I think you're confused," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. "This has been a funeral home for 30 years. Before that, it was a doctor's office," Barnabas finished. "Dr. Harold Morrison, family practice. That's where he killed me." The room felt like it was spinning. "Killed you? But you're Barnabas Wickham. You died of a heart attack." He looked at me then with an expression of such profound sadness that it made my chest hurt. "No," he said quietly. "I'm Thaddeus Moorcock, and Dr. Morrison murdered me in this room 50 years ago." I knew that name. Thaddeus Moorcock had been a missing person case from 1974, back when I was just a kid. He'd come to town looking for work, stayed at the boarding house, and then just vanished one day. Police investigated for months, but never found a trace. "Show me," Barnabas or Thaddeus or whoever he was said, "show me where he hid my body." I should have run, should have grabbed my coat and walked out into that blizzard rather than listen to a dead man talking about murders from 50 years ago. Instead, I followed him as he walked to the far wall, moving with purpose like he knew exactly where he was going. "Here," he said, pressing his palm against what looked like solid wall. "Behind here." The wall looked normal to me, but when I knocked on it, it sounded hollow. We found a crowbar in the maintenance closet, and it didn't take much to pry away what turned out to be a false panel. Behind it was a small space, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, and curled up inside was a skeleton still wearing the rotted remains of a 1970s era work shirt and jeans. The police came as soon as the roads were clear, along with the coroner and the state medical examiner. The bones were definitely from the 1970s, and dental records confirmed what I already knew. They belonged to Thaddeus Moorcock. They also found Dr. Morrison's old medical records in the basement, records that showed Thaddeus had come to him complaining of chest pains. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but there was no death certificate on file, no record of the body being released to a funeral home. Dr. Morrison had been dead for 20 years by then, so there was no one left to prosecute. But the case was finally closed. When I went back to check on Barnabas after the police left, he was just Barnabas again. No memory of sitting up, no knowledge of Thaddeus Moorcock or hidden bodies. Just a man who died shoveling snow, waiting for his family to say goodbye. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I wonder how many other secrets are hidden in these old buildings. How many voices are waiting for someone to listen, someone to help them find peace. I try not to think about it too much, but I always listen now, just in case. Story 8. 22 years I've been preparing the dead for their final rest, and I've learned to mind my own business. Families grieve in different ways. People die in stranger circumstances than you'd imagine, and most of the time, it's not my place to ask questions. But when Quentin Ravenscroft came through my doors, curiosity got the better of me. Quentin was what you might call a paranormal photographer, one of those guys who spent his weekends exploring abandoned buildings with expensive camera equipment, trying to capture evidence of ghosts. Not my cup of tea. But to each their own, I always say. He was only 34 when they found him at the bottom of a stairwell in the old Blackwood Asylum, about 20 miles outside town. The place had been closed since the 1980s, officially condemned for the past decade. Kids dare each other break in sometimes. Urban explorers posted videos online, that sort of thing. Quentin had been documenting the building's decay for some photography project when he apparently took a bad fall down a flight of concrete stairs. broke his neck, died instantly according to coroner. What struck me as odd was that his camera was still hanging around his neck when they brought him in. Usually, if someone takes a fatal tumble, their belongings get scattered. But this expensive digital camera was intact. Not even a scratch on it, hanging from a strap that should have broken under the force of the fall. I know I should have just removed it and put it with his other personal effects, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way his fingers were still curled, like he'd been gripping the camera when he died. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity about what his last photographs looked like. Either way, I found myself turning the camera on after I'd gotten Quentin situated on the preparation table. The memory card was nearly full, hundreds of photos from his exploration of the asylum. I started scrolling through them, and at first, everything looked normal. Quentin had documented his journey methodically. The rusted front gates, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, rooms filled with decades of debris and decay. He was good at what he did. I'll give him that. The photos had an artistic quality to them, playing with light and shadow in ways that made even the most mundane shots look haunting. But as I continued scrolling, something started bothering me about the composition. In the early photos, Quentin was clearly exploring alone. You could tell from the way the camera flash illuminated empty corridors and abandoned rooms. But somewhere around photo number 87, I started noticing shapes in the background, dark forms that could have been shadows, could have been debris, but seemed to move from one shot to the next. By photo 112, there was definitely something following him. I'm not talking about obvious ghost photography here. No transparent figures or floating orbs or any of that nonsense you see on those paranormal TV shows. These were subtle things. A human-shaped shadow at the end of a hallway that wasn't there in the previous shot. A doorway that showed movement where there should have been stillness. Figures that stayed just out of focus, just at the edge of the frame. The timestamp on the photos showed Quentin had been in the building for about 3 hours when things started getting really strange. He'd made his way up to the 3rd floor, the old psychiatric ward, and his photos became more erratic. Some were blurry, like his hands were shaking. Others were taken at odd angles, as if he was looking over his shoulder while shooting. Then came photo 143. Quentin had found an old patient room with a cracked mirror still hanging on the wall. The photo showed him taking a self-portrait in the mirror, camera held up to his face, flash reflecting off the broken glass. But the person in the mirror wasn't Quentin. It was me. Not me as I am now. Mind you, this was me, but wrong. Older, maybe, or sicker. My skin had a gray, waxy quality, and my eyes were sunken and dark. I was wearing the same clothes I had on that night, standing in what looked like the same room. But the me in the mirror looked like a corpse. I nearly dropped the camera. My hands were shaking so bad I had to set it down on the counter and step away for a minute. This was impossible. I'd never been to Blackwood Asylum, never even driven past it. How could I be in a photograph taken 3 days ago by a man I'd never met? But when I picked up the camera again and kept scrolling, things got worse. The final dozen photos were all of mirrors. Different rooms, different angles, but always mirrors, and always showing that corpse-like version of me instead of Quentin. In some shots, the dead me was smiling. In others, I was pointing directly at the camera. In the very last photo, taken just minutes before Quentin's estimated time of death, the mirror me was holding up a sign. It read, "You're next, Percival." I spent the rest of that night researching Blackwood Asylum, digging through old newspaper archives and public records. What I found made my blood run cold. The asylum had employed several morticians over the years to handle the bodies of patients who died in their care. Between 1965 and 1983, 4 different morticians had worked there. All 4 had died in accidents within a year of leaving their positions at the asylum. Car crashes, house fires, industrial accidents. Different causes, but all sudden, all unexpected. The last mortician to work, there was a man named Herbert Ashworth. He quit in 1983, just before the asylum closed, and died 6 months later when he fell down the stairs in his own funeral home. Herbert Ashworth had worked for the same funeral home that employed me now. In fact, he'd worked at the same preparation table where I'd been standing when I looked at those photographs. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, that paranormal photographers faked this stuff all the time for publicity. But over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. Equipment would move on its own. Lights would flicker when I was working alone. And twice, I caught glimpses of that corpse-like version of myself in the mirrors around the funeral home. The breaking point came when I found a newspaper clipping on my desk one morning. It was from 1983, an obituary for Herbert Ashworth. Someone had circled his photo and written in red ink, "Blackwood remembers. I don't work alone anymore. Don't care if it costs extra to have an assistant present for night shifts." And I've never, not once, looked at a dead person's camera again. But sometimes when I catch my reflection in the embalming room mirror, I wonder if what I see looking back is really me, or if it's that other version of myself, the one from the photographs, the one that's already dead. Story 9. 12 years in this business, and I thought I developed a pretty strong stomach. You have to, when you're dealing with bodies that come in all conditions, from all kinds of circumstances. But Dr. Xerxes Holloway tested every limit I thought I had. He'd been found dead in his home study, slumped over his desk with a bottle of whiskey and an empty pill bottle nearby. Suicide, plain and simple, though nobody was particularly surprised. Holloway had been a respected surgeon once, worked at St. Mary's Hospital for over 20 years, but his career had gone to hell in the past few years. Malpractice suits, accusations of drinking on the job, patients dying on his table at an alarming rate. The medical board had stripped his license just 6 months before he killed himself. What surprised me was how his family still wanted a proper funeral. Most people, when someone goes out the way Holloway did, they opt for a quick cremation, try to put the whole mess behind them. But his daughter insisted on an open casket service, said her father deserved dignity regardless of how his life ended. I respected that, even if it meant extra work for me. Holloway came in on a Tuesday morning, and I could tell right away this wasn't going to be routine. The man was 68 years old but looked older, his face gaunt and his skin an unhealthy yellow color that suggested years of hard drinking. His hands were what really caught my attention, though they were pristine. No calluses, no scars, fingernails perfectly manicured. For a man who'd supposedly been drinking himself to death, he'd taken awfully good care of his surgeon's hands. I got him on the table and started the preliminary examination, checking for any injuries or medical devices that might complicate the embalming process. That's when I noticed the scars. They were subtle, hidden in places where clothes would normally cover them. Small incisions along his torso, expertly stitched and healed, but not mentioned anywhere in his medical files. Some looked recent, maybe a few months old. Others appeared to be years old, faded white lines that spoke of multiple surgeries. Self-surgery wasn't unheard of among medical professionals, especially ones with substance abuse problems. But this was extensive, too extensive. I counted at least a dozen separate incision sites, all perfectly executed, all in locations that would be difficult to reach on your own body. I should have called the coroner then, should have reported the unexplained surgical history. Instead, I decided to take some x-rays, just to see what I was dealing with. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Scattered throughout Holloway's abdominal cavity were small metal objects, not surgical clips or medical implants. Those would have been in his records. These were something else entirely. I enhanced the images, adjusted the contrast, and finally made out what they were. Tokens. Small, engraved metal tokens, maybe the size of a quarter, sewn into the lining of his organs with surgical precision. I printed out the x-rays and used a magnifying glass to examine them more closely. Each token had something etched into its surface. Names, it looked like. I could make out parts of words, fragments of letters, but the x-ray resolution wasn't clear enough to read them completely. There was only one way to know for sure what those tokens said. I spent the next 2 hours carefully opening the old surgical sites, following the paths Holloway had cut years earlier. My hands were steady. You develop that kind of control after 12 years of this work, but my mind was racing. What kind of person sews metal objects into their own body? And why? The first token I extracted was about the size of a silver dollar, tarnished with age but still legible. Engraved in neat block letters was a name, Margaret Dutton. Below the name was a date from 8 years ago. I knew that name. Margaret Dutton had died during routine gallbladder surgery at St. Mary's Hospital. There had been complications, they said. These things happen. Dr. Holloway had performed the operation. The second token read William Chun, dated 6 years ago. Another of Holloway's patients. Another surgical death that had been ruled an unfortunate complication. By the time I'd extracted all 12 tokens, I had a collection of names that read like a memorial to medical malpractice. Every single name belonged to a patient who had died on Dr. Holloway's operating table over the past decade. Every single death had been ruled accidental, unavoidable, just one of those tragic things that happen in surgery. But Holloway had kept trophies. I was photographing the tokens with my phone, documenting what I'd found, when Holloway's body started to move. Not the usual post-mortem muscle contractions. I knew what those looked like. This was deliberate, purposeful movement. His arms lifted from his sides, and his hands began to move in precise, practiced motions. The same motions I'd watched hundreds of surgeons make over the years. He was operating. His eyes were still closed, his face slack and lifeless, but his hands moved with the confidence of someone who performed thousands of procedures. He mimed making incisions, suturing wounds, manipulating instruments that weren't there. It was like watching a conductor lead an invisible orchestra, except this orchestra was one of death and pain. I tried to step back from the table, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Something kept me frozen in place, watching as Holloway's corpse performed surgery on the empty air above his chest. His fingers moved with impossible precision, working on patients I couldn't see, repeating the procedures that had ended their lives. Then his eyes opened. They were cloudy with death, but they looked directly at me with intelligence that shouldn't have been possible. His hands never stopped moving, never broke the rhythm of their phantom surgery, but his mouth opened and he spoke in a voice like grinding bone. 12 patients, he said. 12 lives I took. 12 tokens I kept. But there should be 13. His hands finally stopped moving, and he pointed one finger directly at my chest. You found my collection, Cordelia. You opened me up and took out my treasures. That makes you part of the procedure. I managed to stumble backward then, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered to the floor like metallic rain. But Holloway's voice followed me. I always finish what I start. Even dead, I finish what I start. The police found my report about the tokens, along with the evidence I photographed. They reopened the cases of all 12 patients whose names were engraved on those pieces of metal. The medical examiner found traces of a paralytic drug in tissue samples that had been preserved from the original autopsies, something that would have left the patients conscious but unable to move or speak while Holloway killed them. He'd been collecting more than trophies. He'd been collecting the experience of taking life, savoring each murder, hiding the evidence inside his own body where no one would think to look. The victims' families got some closure, I suppose. Justice served, even if it came too late. But I haven't been the same since that night. My hands shake when I work now, and I keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for phantom fingers to guide me through procedures I never learned. Sometimes, when I'm embalming a body, I catch myself making the same precise motions I watched Holloway's corpse perform. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the preparation room, I wonder if his 13th token has my name on it already. Somewhere out there, waiting to be collected. Story 10. 19 years I've been working with the dead, and I've never had a case quite like Seraphina Blackwood. Hell, I still don't even know if that was her real name. She was found on a hiking trail about 5 miles outside town, lying beneath an old oak tree, like she just decided to take a nap. Full wedding dress, complete with veil and everything, but no identification anywhere on her. The dress looked expensive, real silk hand-sewn beadwork, the kind of thing that costs more than most people's cars. But here's the strange part. She'd been out there for at least a week, according to the coroner, exposed to rain and wind and all kinds of weather, yet the dress was pristine. Not a stain, not a tear, not even a wrinkle. The police ran her fingerprints, checked missing persons reports, even had a sketch artist draw her face for the local paper. Nothing. No one came forward to claim her. No one recognized her picture. It was like she materialized out of thin air, already dressed for a wedding that never happened. Since no family stepped forward, the county was paying for a basic burial. Nothing fancy, just a simple service and a plot in the municipal cemetery. But I couldn't bring myself to put her in a cheap pine box wearing that beautiful dress. Call it professional pride, but she deserved better than that. I was preparing her on a Thursday evening, working late because I had 2 other services scheduled for the weekend. The funeral home was empty except for me, quiet as a tomb. Sorry, occupational hazard with the metaphors. I'd gotten Serafina moved to the dressing room, where I keep the good lighting and the full-length mirrors for final preparations. The first weird thing happened when I stepped out to get some cosmetics from the supply room. I was gone maybe 2 minutes, but when I came back, the dress had changed. Instead of the modern wedding gown she'd been wearing, Serafina was now dressed in something from the 1920s, dropped waist, beaded headband, that flapper style. The fabric was different too, heavier silk with a completely different pattern of beadwork. But it fit her perfectly, like it had been tailored specifically for her body. I stood there staring for a good minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe someone from the police department had come by with the dress she was supposed to be buried in, but that didn't make sense. No one claimed her, and besides, I would have heard someone come in. I checked the security cameras, thinking maybe I'd missed something, but the footage showed me leaving the room and coming back, with nothing happening in between. Yet somehow, Serafina's dress had completely changed. I decided to chalk it up to exhaustion and stress. 19 years of this work. Maybe I was finally cracking under pressure. I went back to applying her makeup, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was very wrong. 20 minutes later, I glanced up from the cosmetics palette and nearly dropped the brush. The dress had changed again. This time it was Victorian, high lace collar, dozens of tiny buttons bustling the back. The kind of dress you'd see in daguerreotypes from the 1800s. The beadwork from the previous dress was completely gone, replaced by intricate embroidered flowers and silk trim. I backed away from the table, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't stress or exhaustion. This was something else entirely. That's when I noticed the newspaper clippings. They were scattered on the floor around the dressing table, yellow with age, like someone had dropped them from a great height. I picked up the first one, dated 1987, with the headline, "Local Bride Missing on Wedding Day." The accompanying photo showed a young woman in a modern wedding dress, smiling at the camera. She looked exactly like Serafina. The second clipping was from 1962. Bride-to-be vanishes before ceremony. Different dress, same face. There were 7 clippings in total, spanning from 1924 to 2003. 7 different brides, 7 different wedding dresses, 7 different decades. But every single photograph showed the same woman, the same face, the same sad, knowing smile. All of them had disappeared on their wedding days. All of them were never found. I was still holding the clippings when Serafina opened her eyes. She didn't sit up dramatically or gasp for breath like in the movies. She just opened her eyes, beautiful, dark eyes that seemed to hold decades of sorrow, and looked directly at me. "You found them," she said, her voice soft and melodic, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. I wondered when someone would finally see. See what? I managed to whisper. She smiled, and the same sad smile from all those newspaper photographs. The collection, my beautiful collection of brides who never got their happy endings. As she spoke, I could see other figures beginning to materialize around the room. Translucent at first, then becoming more solid. 7 women in 7 different wedding dresses, all standing silently behind Serafina, like bridesmaids at the world's most horrific ceremony. Each one died on what should have been the happiest day of their lives, Serafina continued, sitting up gracefully on the preparation table. Car accidents, heart attacks, murder, suicide. All that love, all that hope, cut short before they could say, "I do." "What do you want?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. "I collect them," she said simply. "Their dreams, their hopes, their unfulfilled promises of forever. I give them a chance to have the wedding they never got, even if it's in death." One of the ghostly brides stepped forward, The one from 1962, I thought. She promised us we'd find peace, the spirit whispered. She promised us we'd finally get married. But you never do you? I said, understanding beginning to dawn. She keeps you here, trapped in your wedding dresses, waiting for a ceremony that never comes. Serafina's smile turned cold. Everyone deserves a happy ending, Octavius. Even the dead. That's when she told me about Rebecca. Rebecca had been my fiancée 15 years ago. We'd been planning our wedding, had the church booked, the flowers ordered, the whole thing. 3 weeks before the ceremony, she'd gone out to run some last-minute errands and never came home. They found her car wrapped around a tree on a back road. Said she must have fallen asleep at the wheel. I'd never gotten over it. Never even tried to love anyone else. She's been waiting for you, Serafina said, and suddenly I could see Rebecca standing behind the other brides, wearing the dress we'd picked out together. The dress she'd never gotten to wear. All you have to do is join us, Serafina whispered. One simple ceremony, and you can be with her forever. Don't you want to give her the wedding she never had? For a moment, God help me, for a moment, I actually considered it. 15 years of grief and loneliness, and here was a chance to finally be with Rebecca again, to give her the happiness that had been stolen from us. But then I looked into Rebecca's eyes, and I saw the truth. She wasn't happy. None of them were. They were trapped, bound to Serafina's twisted version of eternal love, unable to move on, unable to find peace. No, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Rebecca wouldn't want this. She'd want me to live, not spend eternity as part of your collection. Serafina's face twisted with rage. You could have had everything. You could have been together forever. Forever isn't worth anything if it's built on the suffering of others, I replied. The ghostly bride began to fade then, one by one, their faces showing relief as whatever hold Serafina had on them finally broke. Rebecca was the last to go. She smiled at me, not sad this time, but peaceful, and mouthed the words, I love you, before disappearing into whatever comes after. Serafina let out a shriek that shattered every mirror in the room, then crumbled to dust on the preparation table, taking her wedding dress with her. I never found out who she really was or how long she'd been collecting brides. But I sleep better now, knowing that Rebecca and the others are finally at peace. Sometimes, though, when I'm working late and the funeral home is quiet, I think I can hear the faint sound of wedding bells in the distance. I just hope they're ringing for someone who's actually alive to hear them.